They found the photograph in a locked trunk buried beneath the floorboards of a house scheduled for demolition. March 2024. Richmond, Virginia. The construction crew almost threw it away with the rest of the debris. Almost. The woman in this picture lived in the year 1900. She was 23 years old when this was taken. Her name was inscribed on the back in careful cursive, Magdalena Rose Whitmore. The last of her line. But that inscription was a lie. Magdalena didn't die without heirs. She had a daughter. And that daughter had a daughter. And so on, through 10 complete generations, leading directly to a woman alive today who had no idea her great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother existed. For 124 years, Magdalena Rose Whitmore's story was deliberately erased. Her existence was scrubbed from family records. Her name was removed from the family Bible. Even her grave marker was destroyed. Someone wanted her forgotten. But why would a family work so hard to erase one of their own? What could a young woman in 1900 have possibly done to warrant being removed from history itself? The answer begins with what we found next. Tucked beneath that photograph was a letter. Unopened. Sealed with black wax. The address written in the same careful hand, to whoever finds this, open only if you are prepared for the truth. Inside that letter were 3 sentences that would unravel everything. I am not who they said I was. I am not where they said I would be. And if you are reading this, then I succeeded. If this story has captured your attention, subscribe now because what comes next will challenge everything you thought you knew about family, survival, and the lengths people will go to protect their secrets. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because this journey into the past reveals truths that echo into our present day. To understand what happened to Magdalena Rose Whitmore, you must first understand the world she was born into. The year 1900 marked the threshold of a new century. America was transforming. Electricity was replacing gas lamps in wealthy homes. The first automobiles appeared on city streets. Photographs were becoming more common, though still expensive and reserved for special occasions. But beneath this veneer of progress, society remained bound by rigid rules. Women could not vote. They could not own property in most states without a husband's permission. Their value was measured by their ability to marry well and produce legitimate heirs. For wealthy families like the Whitmores, reputation was currency. A scandal could destroy not just one person, but an entire bloodline standing in society. The Whitmores were old money. Plantation owners before the Civil War, they had somehow maintained their wealth through Reconstruction. By 1900, they owned textile mills, invested in railroads, and held positions on every important board in Richmond. They lived in a 23-room mansion on Monument Avenue. Servants' quarters housed 14 staff members. The family hosted elaborate parties attended by governors, senators, and foreign dignitaries. Magdalena Rose Whitmore was their only child. She was born in 1877 to Marcus and Violet Whitmore. Her birth was announced in every major newspaper from Richmond to Boston. Her christening gown was imported from France. Her education included private tutors in literature, music, French, and Latin. At 17, she was presented to society at the annual Richmond debutante ball. Accounts from that evening describe her as extraordinarily beautiful and possessing unusual intelligence for a woman of her station. She was expected to marry well, to produce children, to maintain the family name. She did none of these things. Or rather, that's what the official record claims. According to the Whitmore family genealogy published in 1920, Magdalena Rose Whitmore died in 1902 at the age of 25. Cause of death, consumption. Buried in the family plot at Hollywood Cemetery. Never married. No children. Every single word of that is false. In February 2024, a woman named Sarah Caldwell submitted her DNA to an ancestry website. She was curious about her heritage, nothing more. A simple genealogy project for a family reunion. The results connected her to the Whitmore family. But not through the documented line. Her DNA showed she descended from someone the Whitmore records claimed never existed. Someone who had a child in secret. Someone whose entire existence had been carefully, methodically removed from history. Sarah would later describe the moment she saw Magdalena's photograph for the first time. She said it felt like looking into a mirror across time. The same eyes. The same shape of the face. The same expression, determined, defiant, unbroken. The genetic match was undeniable. Sarah Caldwell was Magdalena's great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-granddaughter. Which meant Magdalena had done something that 10 generations of Whitmores tried desperately to hide. She had survived. She had a child. And somehow, against all odds, that bloodline continued in secret for 124 years. The search for the truth began with that letter. For 3 weeks, historians debated whether to open it. The seal was intact. The paper is fragile. Opening it might destroy the only direct communication from Magdalena that still existed. They opened it on March 28, 2024. Inside, written in that same precise cursive, was a confession. Not of a crime, but of an act that in 1900 might as well have been criminal for a woman of her status. My name is Magdalena Rose Whitmore. I write this in the year of our Lord 1900, from a place my family believes I will never escape. They are wrong. On the evening of April 16, 1899, I bore a daughter. Her father was not the man my parents chose for me. He was not wealthy. He was not white. And when my condition became known, my family had 2 choices: face public shame or erase me entirely. The official story given to Richmond society was simple. Magdalena had fallen ill. She needed rest. Extended travel in Europe was recommended by physicians. She departed in January 1899 and would remain abroad for an indefinite period. But Magdalena never boarded a ship to Europe. She was taken, in the middle of the night, to a private asylum 40 miles outside Richmond. A place called Rosewood Manor. An institution that specialized in housing inconvenient daughters from wealthy families. Rosewood Manor no longer exists. It burned down in 1947. But the record survived. Magdalena Rose Whitmore was admitted on January 12, 1899. She was 4 months pregnant. The admission papers were signed by her father and a physician who testified she was mentally unstable and a danger to herself. She was 21 years old. According to the letter, she spent the next 4 months in a locked room. She was permitted no visitors. No correspondence. The staff was told she was a dangerous patient requiring isolation. On April 16, 1899, she gave birth to a daughter. There is no official birth certificate. No hospital record. No doctor's name. Just a notation in the Rosewood Manor ledger: patient 127 delivered female child, April 16, 1899. Child removed per family instruction. Removed. That single word contains the heart of this mystery. Where was the child taken? Who raised her? And how did Magdalena, locked in an asylum, declared mentally unfit, stripped of all legal rights, how did she manage to ensure her daughter survived? The letter's final paragraph reads, "They believe they have won. They believe I will remain here until I am broken, until I recant, until I agree to their terms. They have promised me that if I cooperate, if I sign papers declaring myself unfit, if I agree never to speak of what happened, they will release me in 2 years' time. They will restore a small portion of my inheritance. They will allow me to live quietly, forgotten. I will sign nothing. I will confess nothing. And I will not be here in 2 years." Magdalena Rose Whitmore was discharged from Rosewood Manor on November 3, 1900. 18 months after admission. 6 months earlier than her family's promised release date. The discharge paperwork lists her status as absconded. She escaped. On the night of November 2, 1900, during a thunderstorm that knocked out gas lighting throughout the facility, Magdalena Rose Whitmore disappeared from a locked room on the 3rd floor of Rosewood Manor. The window was found open. The bars removed. A bedsheet rope tied to the frame. Footprints led to the woods beyond the property, then vanished. She was never seen by her family again. 2 years later, in 1902, the Whitmore family announced that Magdalena had died abroad from consumption. They held a memorial service. They erected a gravestone in the family plot, though no body was ever buried there. To the world, Magdalena Rose Whitmore was dead. But somewhere in America, a young woman who had escaped an asylum was raising a daughter no one was supposed to know existed. A daughter whose own daughter would have a daughter. 10 generations of women, living ordinary lives, never knowing they descended from a woman who vanished into history. Until that trunk was opened beneath the floorboards. Until someone decided it was time for the truth. The investigation into what happened after Magdalena's escape required piecing together fragments from a dozen different sources. Census records. Church registries. Employment ledgers. Immigration documents. Railroad manifests. Each piece alone meant nothing. Together, they told a story of remarkable courage and careful planning. The first clue came from an unexpected source. A diary kept by one of the nurses at Rosewood Manor. The diary wasn't discovered until 2019, tucked inside a donated box of books at a Virginia estate sale. The entries were mundane, mostly complaints about working conditions and difficult patients. But one entry from October 1900 stood out. She writes, "The new patient in room 14 troubles me. Not for her behavior, which is calm and reasonable, but for the wrongness of her being here at all. She speaks with education. She reads constantly. She shows no signs of the afflictions that supposedly warranted her confinement. Today she asked me about my family. She remembered my daughter's name from a conversation 3 weeks prior. What mad person retains such details? I begin to wonder what truths these walls conceal." The nurse's name was Eleanor Marsh. She was 42 years old, widowed, raising 2 children on a nurse's salary. According to employment records, Eleanor Marsh resigned from Rosewood Manor on November 4, 1900. One day after Magdalena's escape. No explanation given. No forwarding address listed. She simply disappeared from the employment rolls. For over a century, this coincidence went unnoticed. But when researchers cross-referenced Eleanor's last known address with property records, they found something remarkable. In December 1900, Eleanor Marsh purchased a small house in Chattanooga, Tennessee. The purchase price was $200, paid in full, in cash. This was approximately 6 months' salary for a nurse in 1900. Where did Eleanor Marsh get that money? The answer lies in what researchers discovered next. Birth records from Chattanooga, Tennessee, filed in May 1900. A child named Rose Eleanor Marsh, born April 20, 1900, to mother listed as Eleanor Marsh, father unknown. But April 20, 1900, was 4 days after Magdalena gave birth at Rosewood Manor. And the name Rose, Magdalena's middle name. The pieces began to fit together. Magdalena had somehow made contact with Eleanor Marsh. She had convinced the nurse to help her. And the plan they devised was both simple and brilliant. Eleanor would claim the child as her own. In 1900, with no standardized birth certificate system, this was easier than it might seem. A midwife's statement, a church baptism record, and a child's identity was established. No one questioned a nurse returning from a few weeks away with a newborn, claiming a hasty marriage and quick widowhood. But Magdalena needed more than just someone to take her child. She needed money to pay Eleanor. She needed assurance the child would be cared for. She needed a way to maintain some connection, however distant, to the daughter she would never publicly claim. The Whitmore family had substantial wealth. Magdalena had no access to it. Or did she? Property records from Richmond reveal something the Whitmore family likely forgot about. When Magdalena was born, her maternal grandmother established a small trust in her name. Nothing compared to the family fortune, but a modest sum of bonds and property that would become Magdalena's at age 21. The trust was set up before Virginia law fully stripped married women of property rights, and it included unusual provisions for the time. The bonds could not be touched by Magdalena's future husband. They could not be seized for family debts. And they could only be accessed by Magdalena herself with proper identification. In August 1900, 3 months before her escape, someone presented documents at a Richmond bank and liquidated a series of bonds belonging to Magdalena Rose Whitmore. Total value, $537. The bank clerk noted the transaction was unusual but legal. The woman who collected the money matched the description on file. She provided appropriate documentation. She signed the required papers. The money was released. How did Magdalena, locked in an asylum 40 miles away, access that bank? The answer required examining the asylum visitor logs. Rosewood Manor kept meticulous records of who entered and exited the facility. Most entries were staff, delivery men, physicians. But one name appeared monthly from May through September 1900. A Mrs. Helena Worth, listed as a charitable volunteer, approved to visit patients for moral instruction. There is no record of any charitable organization called Helena Worth. There is no census listing, no church membership, no property record for anyone by that name in Virginia in 1900. Helena Worth was a fiction. But whoever used that name had official approval to enter Rosewood Manor. She had access to the patients. And she came specifically during the months between Magdalena giving birth and Magdalena escaping. The theory that emerged is this. Magdalena, through coded messages or brief conversations with Eleanor Marsh, arranged for someone to pose as a charitable visitor. This person, this Helena Worth, served as a messenger between Magdalena and the outside world. She likely carried out Magdalena's instructions regarding the bonds. She may have delivered money to Eleanor Marsh. She almost certainly helped coordinate the escape plan. But who was Helena Worth? This question led researchers down an entirely different path. One that would reveal Magdalena's life before the asylum. One that would expose the secret that led to her imprisonment. According to Richmond Society pages from 1898, Magdalena Rose Whitmore was engaged to be married. The announcement appeared in April. The wedding was set for November. The groom was Lawrence Theodore Ashford III, son of a prominent banking family from Charleston. The match was everything the Whitmores wanted. Old money marrying old money. Southern aristocracy consolidating power. The wedding would be the social event of the season. Except the wedding never happened. In September 1898, the engagement was quietly called off. No public announcement. No explanation. Society whispered about it for weeks, then moved on to other scandals. But private letters from that period, preserved in the Ashford family papers now held at the Charleston Historical Society, tell a different story. In a letter dated September 12, 1898, Lawrence Ashford writes to his mother, "I have ended the engagement to Miss Whitmore as we discussed. The situation is untenable. Her affections are plainly engaged elsewhere, and I will not be made a fool by marrying a woman whose heart belongs to another. Let the Whitmores concoct whatever story preserves their dignity. I am finished with the matter." Who was this other man? Richmond was a city of strict social hierarchy. White society moved in clearly defined circles. Everyone knew everyone's business. Or thought they did. Magdalena's activities would have been monitored, chaperoned, controlled. How did she meet someone unsuitable enough to destroy an engagement to one of the South's most eligible bachelors? The answer lay not in Richmond society papers, but in an entirely different set of records. In 1898, the Whitmore family hired a new music tutor for Magdalena. Her previous instructor had retired, and Mrs. Whitmore wanted her daughter to continue her piano studies. The new instructor's name was recorded in the household account books. Payment of $3 per week to Professor J. Morrison for piano instruction, beginning March 1898. Finding Professor J. Morrison required searching through city directories, tax records, and business licenses. What researchers eventually discovered was this. Joshua Morrison, listed as a music professor, age 26, residing at a boarding house on Clay Street. Race, colored. This single word, buried in a census document, changed everything. Joshua Morrison was a free black man in a city still deeply segregated, still carrying the weight of its Confederate past. He was educated, accomplished enough to teach music to wealthy families. And somehow, he and Magdalena Rose Whitmore had fallen in love. In 1898 Virginia, their relationship wasn't just scandalous. It was illegal. Anti-miscegenation laws prohibited marriage between white and black people. The penalties included imprisonment. The social consequences included complete ostracism, loss of property, violence. For a family like the Whitmores, this relationship represented the ultimate threat to their standing. When they discovered it, and they must have discovered it given the broken engagement, they would have acted swiftly. What happened to Joshua Morrison? City directories show him listed at his Clay Street address through November 1898. In the 1899 directory, his name is gone. No forwarding address. No death certificate. No record of him leaving Richmond through any official channel. He simply vanished from the paper trail the same way Magdalena would vanish a year later. But unlike Magdalena, Joshua Morrison left one trace behind. In the archives of a small black church in Chattanooga, Tennessee, the same city where Eleanor Marsh moved, there is a record of a Joshua Marsh joining the congregation in January 1900. Joshua Marsh. A piano teacher. A man approximately the right age. And the surname Marsh, the same name Eleanor gave to Magdalena's child. It seems impossible that this is coincidence. The theory that emerged from these connected facts is this. When the Whitmores discovered Magdalena's pregnancy, they had Joshua Morrison driven out of Richmond. He fled to Chattanooga, where he had some family connection or friend willing to help him start over. Magdalena, locked in the asylum, somehow got a message to him. Eleanor Marsh, the sympathetic nurse, was likely the connection. Perhaps Eleanor was a distant relative of Joshua. Perhaps she was simply a compassionate woman who saw the injustice of the situation. Together, they formed a plan. Eleanor would claim the child. Joshua would take Eleanor's surname to create a family unit that wouldn't raise questions. And Magdalena would find a way to escape and join them. The money from Magdalena's bonds would finance the entire operation. The mysterious Helena Worth who visited the asylum was likely a friend of Joshua's, someone willing to take the risk of helping. Everything was coordinated for November 1900. Eleanor resigned from Rosewood Manor. The escape was timed for a stormy night when visibility would be poor and guards less attentive. And somewhere in the chaos of that thunderstorm, Magdalena Rose Whitmore climbed out a third-floor window and disappeared into a new life. Census records from 1910 tell the rest of the story, or at least the beginning of it. In Chattanooga, Tennessee, living in a modest house on Oak Street, there is a family listed: Joshua Marsh, age 38, occupation piano teacher. Eleanor Marsh, age 52, occupation seamstress. Rose Marsh, age 10. And Mary Marsh, age 8. Mary. A daughter not mentioned in any birth records because she wasn't born in Chattanooga. A daughter who would have been born around 1902, which means she was conceived around 1901, which means Magdalena made it to Chattanooga. Magdalena and Joshua, who could not legally marry, lived together under the protection of Eleanor's presence in the household. To their neighbors, to anyone who asked, they were related through Eleanor. Joshua and Magdalena were perhaps presented as cousins or distant family members, both widowed, both helping to raise their children and support aging Eleanor. It wouldn't have been a completely safe arrangement. Interracial households, even ones with plausible explanations, drew attention in the segregated South. They would have been careful. Kept to themselves. Lived quietly. But they were together. And that census record, listing Mary Marsh as Joshua's daughter, proves Magdalena didn't just survive. She built a life. She had a second child. She lived as the woman she chose to be, not the woman her family demanded she become. For 18 more years, Magdalena lived in that house in Chattanooga. We know this because of another set of records. Death certificates. Eleanor Marsh died in 1912 of heart failure. Joshua Morrison, using his adopted surname Marsh, died in 1918 during the influenza pandemic. And in November 1918, just 3 weeks after Joshua's death, there is a death certificate for Mary Rose Morrison, age 41, cause of death influenza. Mary Rose Morrison. Not Mary Marsh. Not Magdalena Whitmore. A new name entirely. Perhaps the name she and Joshua used privately. Perhaps the name that represented her true self, free from both her family's legacy and the constraints of the law. She died at age 41, 19 years after escaping that asylum. 19 years of freedom. 19 years with the man she loved. 19 years watching her daughters grow. Rose Marsh, the daughter born at Rosewood Manor, was 19 years old when Magdalena died. Mary Marsh, the younger daughter, was 17. Both young women were old enough to remember their mother. Old enough to have been told the truth of who she was and what she had survived. But here the historical record grows difficult again. Rose Marsh appears in the 1920 census, living in Chattanooga, working as a seamstress, unmarried. By 1930, she's gone from Tennessee records entirely. Mary Marsh married in 1922 to a man named Thomas Caldwell. She moved to Atlanta. She had 3 children. And she never, as far as can be determined, told anyone about her mother's real identity. Why the silence? Why continue the secret even after everyone involved had died? The answer likely lies in the times. Even in the 1920s and 30s, admitting to being the child of an interracial relationship could destroy your life. It could cost you employment, housing, safety. It could endanger your own children. So Mary Marsh Caldwell kept her mother's story hidden. She raised her children without mentioning their grandmother's aristocratic origins or the dramatic escape that made their existence possible. Through the decades, through the generations, the story faded into silence. Mary's children knew their grandmother died young. They didn't know she was born Magdalena Rose Whitmore. They didn't know about the mansion on Monument Avenue or the asylum or the famous family that erased her from history. Mary's daughter, Margaret, born in 1923, married and had children of her own. She lived an ordinary life in Atlanta, working as a schoolteacher. Margaret's daughter, born in 1951, never heard the name Whitmore. She raised her own children in the 1970s and 80s with no knowledge that they descended from Richmond aristocracy. Each generation lived normal, middle-class lives. Teachers, nurses, electricians, accountants. Ordinary people with an extraordinary ancestor they knew nothing about. Until Sarah Caldwell, born in 1982, the great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-granddaughter of Magdalena Rose Whitmore, submitted her DNA to an ancestry website and shattered 124 years of silence. When Sarah received her DNA results showing a connection to the Whitmore family, she initially thought it was an error. Her family was black. The Whitmores were a white family. There was no logical connection. But the genetic markers don't lie. Sarah shared significant DNA with documented Whitmore descendants. Which meant somewhere in her family tree, there was a connection no one had ever mentioned. Sarah began researching. She contacted the Whitmore family descendants. Most ignored her. One responded with hostility, accusing her of trying to make false claims on a family legacy. But one elderly Whitmore cousin, a genealogy enthusiast in her 80s, was intrigued rather than defensive. This cousin, Margaret Whitmore Stevens, had always wondered about the gap in the family records. Magdalena's death abroad had never made complete sense to her. Why was there no detailed record of the illness? Why did no family member travel to Europe to bring her home? Why was the grave empty? Margaret suggested they hire a professional genealogist to investigate. That investigation led to the Richmond house scheduled for demolition. The house had been built in 1875 and had changed hands many times over the years. But property records showed it had briefly been owned by a Mrs. Helena Worth in 1900 and 1901. That name, Helena Worth, the mysterious visitor to Rosewood Manor. This was her house. And when demolition crews opened up the floors to check for structural issues before tearing the building down, they found the trunk. Sealed. Hidden. Waiting. Inside the trunk was the photograph. The letter. And something else. A leather-bound journal, pages yellowed but still legible. Magdalena's journal, written during her months at Rosewood Manor. The entries are heartbreaking and defiant in equal measure. She writes about the day she realized she was pregnant. The joy mixed with terror. The certainty that her family would never accept her choice. The decision to tell her parents the truth rather than lie, believing honesty might lead to mercy. She was wrong about the mercy. Her father's rage, her mother's cold horror, the speed with which they arranged her disappearance. She writes about the asylum. The isolation. The fear that she would never see her daughter again. But she also writes about hope. About Eleanor, the kind nurse who listened to her story and believed her. About getting messages out through Helena, about the careful planning of an escape that seemed impossible. One entry from September 1900 reads, "Today Eleanor brought me news that Rose is thriving. She has my eyes," Eleanor says. She has Joshua's steady temperament. She is healthy and loved. This knowledge sustains me through everything else. They can lock me away. They can declare me mad. They can tell the world I am dead. But my daughter lives. She is real. She is proof that love, even forbidden love, even punished love, creates life that cannot be erased. Another entry from October, Helena visited today. She brought money from the bonds. Everything is arranged. In 3 weeks, during the new moon when the nights are darkest, I will leave this place. Joshua is waiting in Chattanooga. Eleanor will bring Rose. We will not have the life my family imagined for me. We will have something better. We will have truth. The final entry in the journal is dated November 1, 1900. Tomorrow night. Eleanor has confirmed the guards' work in rotation. The storm is predicted. Helena has arranged for a wagon to be waiting at the crossroads 2 miles north. I have practiced the route from the window to the woods 100 times in my mind. I am terrified. I am certain. If I die attempting this, at least I die free. If I succeed, I will live as myself. Not as my family's daughter. Not as Lawrence Ashford's wife. Not as the woman society demands. As Magdalena. As Joshua's love. As Rose's mother. That is worth any risk. The journal ends there. But we know what happened next. She succeeded. She made it to that wagon. She traveled to Chattanooga. She reclaimed her daughter. She lived 18 more years as the woman she chose to be. The discovery of the trunk and its contents triggered a wave of research and reflection. For the Whitmore descendants, it forced a reckoning with their family's history. The cruelty of locking away a pregnant daughter. The lies they told to maintain social standing. The erasure of a woman whose only crime was loving someone her family didn't approve of. For Sarah Caldwell, it provided context for her entire life. The family stories that never quite added up. The gaps in genealogy. The sense that something important had been left unsaid. She organized a gathering of all the women in her family line. Her mother, her grandmother, her aunts and cousins. She told them the story of Magdalena Rose Whitmore. Some wept. Some were angry about the years of silence. But all of them felt a strange sense of completion, as if a missing piece of their identity had finally been restored. Sarah reached out to the Whitmore family formally, not seeking money or recognition, but offering connection. Margaret Whitmore Stevens, the elderly cousin who had helped with the research, agreed to meet. The meeting took place in Richmond, in a neutral location, a conference room at the Historical Society. Two branches of a family, separated by over a century, by race, by choice, by cruelty and love, sitting down together. They compared photographs. Sarah's features, so clearly echoing Magdalena's. The way certain gestures, certain expressions, had survived through 10 generations. They shared family stories. The Whitmore side talked about their memories of the grand house on Monument Avenue, sold decades ago, now a museum. Sarah talked about her grandmother's stories of growing up in Atlanta, never knowing her roots reached back to Virginia aristocracy. Margaret Whitmore Stevens made a formal statement that day. She acknowledged what her family had done to Magdalena. She apologized, a century too late but meaningful nonetheless. She invited Sarah to be included in the official Whitmore family genealogy, to correct the lies published in 1920. Sarah accepted. Not for herself, but for Magdalena. So that the woman who defied her family, who escaped an asylum, who built a life on her own terms, would finally be remembered accurately. The updated genealogy now reads, Magdalena Rose Whitmore, born 1877, died 1918. Married Joshua Morrison in common-law union. 2 daughters, Rose Eleanor, born 1899, and Mary Rose, born 1902. 10 generations of descendants through the line of Mary Rose Morrison Caldwell, including Sarah Elizabeth Caldwell, born 1982. The historical significance of Magdalena's story extends beyond one family. Her experience illuminates the brutal reality for women in 1900 who defied expectations. The ease with which families could institutionalize daughters. The legal mechanisms that stripped women of rights. The racial laws that criminalized love across color lines. But it also illuminates resistance. Magdalena refused to be broken. She found allies in unexpected places. She escaped impossible circumstances. She lived freely for nearly 2 decades, raising her children, loving Joshua, building a life that had no template in her society. She represents thousands of women whose stories were erased, whose defiance was punished, whose names were removed from family records because they loved the wrong person or made the wrong choice or simply wanted autonomy over their own lives. Historians have begun researching other cases similar to Magdalena's. How many women were locked in asylums for being pregnant outside marriage? How many interracial families lived in secret, using creative arrangements to avoid persecution? How many family trees have gaps like the Whitmore genealogy, places where someone was deliberately removed? The Rosewood Manor records alone, before the building burned, contained entries for over 300 women between 1880 and 1947. How many of their stories mirror Magdalena's? How many daughters were erased? For the Black community's historians, Joshua Morrison's story is equally significant. A free black man in 1898 Richmond, educated, employed in white households, yet forced to flee when his relationship with a white woman was discovered. How many black men's lives were destroyed by similar circumstances? How many were not fortunate enough to escape with their lives? The descendants of Magdalena through Sarah Caldwell have embraced their complex heritage. They acknowledge the privilege Magdalena was born into and the injustice she suffered. They honor Joshua Morrison's courage and the impossible position he was placed in by racist laws. They celebrate Eleanor Marsh, the nurse who risked her job and possibly her safety to help a desperate mother keep contact with her child. And they remember the mysterious Helena Worth, whoever she was, who helped coordinate an escape that should have been impossible. In 2024, Sarah Caldwell organized a memorial service for Magdalena. It was held in Chattanooga, at the site where the Oak Street house once stood. The house where Magdalena lived those 18 years is gone now, replaced by a parking lot. But Sarah arranged for a historical marker to be placed there. It reads, "On this site stood the home of Mary Rose Morrison, born Magdalena Rose Whitmore, 1877 to 1918. A woman who chose love over legacy, freedom over security, and truth over the lies her family demanded. Mother, partner, survivor. May her courage inspire all who learn her story." The marker includes both her names, Whitmore and Morrison, acknowledging both her origins and her chosen identity. It mentions Joshua by name, giving public recognition to a relationship that was illegal in its time. And it honors the life she lived after escape, not just the dramatic circumstances of her imprisonment and flight. The Whitmore family, through Margaret Stevens, contributed financially to the marker. A small gesture, but a meaningful acknowledgement that the family's modern descendants reject their ancestors' choices. At the dedication ceremony, both black descendants through Sarah and white descendants through Margaret stood together. They planted a rose bush, for Rose, the daughter born in an asylum who lived to raise her own children in freedom. They planted a magnolia tree, for Mary, the second daughter whose married name, Caldwell, carried the story forward through the generations. Sarah gave a speech that day. She talked about receiving her DNA results and having her understanding of her family completely transformed. She talked about the trunk under the floorboards and the photograph that looked so much like her own face. She talked about reading Magdalena's journal entries and feeling a connection across time to a woman who refused to accept the limitations placed on her. And she talked about what it means to reclaim a hidden history. For over a century, this story was buried. Hidden by family shame on one side. Hidden by necessity and survival on the other. But DNA doesn't forget. Truth doesn't disappear just because it's inconvenient. And now, 10 generations later, we can finally say her name. Magdalena Rose Whitmore Morrison. We can honor her choices. We can acknowledge that her love for Joshua and his love for her was real, valuable, and worth the risks they took. We can celebrate that their daughters lived. That those daughters had daughters. That the line continued despite every obstacle placed in its path. Margaret Whitmore Stevens also spoke. She acknowledged her family's role in trying to erase Magdalena. She talked about discovering the truth and feeling ashamed of her ancestors' cruelty. But she also talked about the importance of facing difficult history rather than hiding from it. The Whitmore family will now include this story in our official history. Not the sanitized version from 1920. The real story. Magdalena's imprisonment. Her interracial relationship. Her escape. Her life in Chattanooga. We will teach our children about her. Not as a scandal to be ashamed of, but as a reminder that our family, like so many families, participated in systems of oppression. That we used our privilege to hurt someone who deserved protection. And that we must do better. The story of Magdalena Rose Whitmore and her 10-generation secret has implications that reach beyond one family or one city. It speaks to the American experience of hidden histories and mixed heritage. To the ways families create myths to protect social standing. To the violence of laws that criminalized love across racial lines. To the asylums that warehoused inconvenient women. To the courage of individuals who resisted despite overwhelming odds. Since the story became public, dozens of other families have come forward with similar tales. A woman in North Carolina discovered through DNA testing that her great-great-grandmother was the mixed-race daughter of a plantation owner's white daughter and an enslaved man, hidden away in census records under false names. A man in Georgia found documentation that his white great-great-grandfather had a second family with a black woman, maintaining 2 households in different towns, the mixed-race children recorded under the mother's surname only. These stories, hidden for generations, are surfacing now because of DNA testing technology and because social attitudes have shifted enough that descendants feel safe investigating their true heritage. Each discovery is personal and particular. But collectively, they paint a picture of an America much more interconnected, much more mixed, much more resistant to its own rules than official records suggested. Magdalena's story has also resonated with people dealing with family estrangement for other reasons. People whose families rejected them for being gay, for marrying outside their religion, for choosing careers over traditional roles. The specifics differ, but the core truth remains: families throughout history have cast out members who defied expectations. And those cast out members, when they survived, often built beautiful lives despite the rejection. The journal entries that Magdalena left behind have been particularly powerful for readers. Her voice, preserved across 124 years, speaks directly to anyone who has ever felt trapped by others' expectations. In one entry from July 1900, she writes, "They tell me I am sick. That my feelings are symptoms of moral corruption. That a proper woman would never have developed affection for someone like Joshua. But I know my own mind. I know my own heart. What I feel for him is the most real thing in my life. More real than their rules. More real than their opinions. If loving him is sickness, then I embrace the diagnosis. I would rather be sick and honest than healthy and living a lie." This entry has been shared widely on social media, resonating with young people struggling with family acceptance of their identities or relationships. Another entry from August 1900, "I think often about what my life was supposed to be." Mrs. Lawrence Ashford. Hostess of grand parties. Mother to legitimate heirs. Maintainer of social connections and family reputation. It sounds like death to me. A slow suffocation inside a beautiful prison. I would rather risk everything for 1 year of authentic life than spend 50 years performing a role. When I hold Rose, when I imagine building a life with Joshua, I feel alive in a way I never felt in that mansion. This is the exchange I have chosen. Freedom for security. Love for approval. Truth for comfort. I do not regret it. These words, written by a woman facing an uncertain future in an asylum, not knowing if her escape plan would work, have inspired people facing their own difficult choices between security and authenticity. The physical artifacts from the trunk are now housed at the Virginia Historical Society. The photograph of Magdalena. The letter with the black wax seal. The journal. They're displayed alongside the asylum admission papers and the census records and the death certificates that together tell the full story. The exhibit is called Hidden Branches: Untold Stories of American Families. Magdalena's story is the centerpiece, but the exhibit also includes dozens of other similar cases uncovered by researchers. Each one represents a person who was erased, a story that was hidden, a truth that was buried for generations. The exhibit has become one of the most visited at the Historical Society. People come to see Magdalena's photograph, to read her words, to stand in front of the evidence of her existence and her resistance. For Sarah Caldwell, the discovery has transformed her sense of identity and purpose. She has become an advocate for adoptees and descendants seeking their biological histories. She gives talks about the importance of knowing your roots, even when those roots are complicated or painful. She emphasizes that family secrets, especially secrets about race and heritage, cause harm across generations. Her own children, teenagers now, are growing up with full knowledge of their ancestry. They know about Magdalena and Joshua. They know about the courage it took to love across racial lines in 1900. They know about the escape from the asylum and the life built in Chattanooga. And they know they descend from both privilege and oppression, from both white wealth and black resilience, from both cruelty and courage. Sarah has also connected with other descendants of Joshua Morrison. Joshua had siblings, and their lines have continued as well. Meeting Joshua's descendants has been emotional for Sarah. These are people who share ancestors with her not through Magdalena, but through Joshua. They've shared family stories about Joshua that never appeared in official records. How he loved music and taught piano to children in the black community for free. How he was known for his patience and gentleness. How he mourned when he had to leave Richmond but built a good life in Chattanooga. How he loved Magdalena with a steadiness that never wavered, even through the years when they were separated, even through the social pressure they faced living together. One of Joshua's descendants, an elderly man named James Morrison, shared a story that had been passed down in his family. He said Joshua's grandfather, born enslaved, had told Joshua when he was young, "The law says we're less than human. But we know better. We love, we create, we survive. Don't let their laws define your humanity. Live your truth, even when it's dangerous." James believes this teaching gave Joshua the courage to pursue a relationship with Magdalena despite knowing the risks. And he believes Magdalena, coming from such different circumstances, demonstrated equal courage in choosing Joshua despite losing everything her world told her mattered. Together, they proved that love could transcend the brutal social hierarchies of their time. The meeting between Sarah's family and James Morrison's family was documented by a filmmaker working on a short documentary about Magdalena's story. The film, titled The Letter in the Trunk, premiered at a documentary film festival in 2024 and has since been screened at universities and historical societies across the country. It uses the artifacts, the archival records, the DNA evidence, and interviews with descendants to tell Magdalena's story. But it also contextualizes her experience within the broader history of anti-miscegenation laws, asylum abuse, and women's lack of legal rights in the early 20th century. The film has sparked discussions about how many other stories like Magdalena's exist, waiting to be discovered. Genealogists estimate that virtually every American with colonial-era ancestry has mixed-race heritage somewhere in their family tree, even if it's not visible or known. The laws against interracial relationships existed because such relationships were happening, constantly, throughout American history. Usually these relationships were exploitative, involving enslaved women and white enslavers. But sometimes, like with Magdalena and Joshua, they were relationships based on genuine love and mutual choice. Those relationships were no less illegal and no less dangerous, but they were fundamentally different in nature. They represented what was possible when people saw each other as human beings first, rather than as categories to be kept separate. The Whitmore family's modern descendants have had varied reactions to the revelations. Some have embraced the expanded understanding of their family history. Others have been resistant, preferring the simpler narrative where Magdalena died young and tragic but conventional. One branch of the family refused to acknowledge Sarah or any of the Morrison descendants, insisting the DNA evidence must be flawed or fraudulent. But others, like Margaret Whitmore Stevens, have become vocal advocates for truth and reconciliation. Margaret has given interviews to historical journals and newspapers. She's spoken at conferences about genealogy and family history. And she's worked with Sarah to ensure Magdalena's story is taught accurately. Together, they co-wrote an article for a historical journal titled, Erased No More, Recovering the Life of Magdalena Rose Whitmore Morrison. The article presents all the evidence methodically, walking readers through each piece of documentation that led to the full picture of Magdalena's life. For historians, Magdalena's case has become a teaching tool. It demonstrates how much of history is hidden in gaps and silences. How official records often lie or omit. How family genealogies are curated to present a particular image. And how patient research, combining many different types of sources, can recover stories that were meant to stay buried. Students studying historical methodology now examine the Whitmore case as an example of how to reconstruct a life from fragmentary evidence. The combination of census data, asylum records, birth and death certificates, property records, bank documents, church registries, family letters, and DNA evidence created a complete picture only when assembled together. No single source told the full truth. But together, they revealed what had been hidden. The story has also raised questions about who gets to control historical narratives. For over a century, the Whitmore family controlled Magdalena's story by erasing it entirely. They had the social power to make her disappear from records. They had the financial resources to maintain the fiction of her death abroad. And they had the racial privilege that allowed them to erase an interracial relationship without significant outside questioning. But they couldn't control DNA. They couldn't control the physical evidence Magdalena left behind in that trunk. And they couldn't control the determination of descendants who wanted to know the truth. In the end, Magdalena's voice, speaking from 1900 through her journal entries, proved stronger than all the institutional power that tried to silence her. The question of what happened to Rose, the first daughter born at Rosewood Manor, remains partially unanswered. She appears in census records through 1920 but disappears after that. Some researchers believe she may have married and changed her name, then moved out of state, making her difficult to track. Others speculate she may have died young, perhaps in the 1918 flu pandemic like her mother and Joshua, but that no death certificate was filed. Or she may have deliberately made herself hard to find, uncomfortable with attention or wanting to protect her privacy. Unlike her sister Mary, who stayed in one place long enough to establish a clear paper trail, Rose seems to have lived a more mobile or private life. Sarah Caldwell has indicated she'd like to find out what happened to Rose, to give both of Magdalena's daughters equal acknowledgement in the historical record. The search continues. The house where the trunk was found, scheduled for demolition, was ultimately preserved after the discovery. The Richmond Historical Preservation Board voted to save the structure and convert it into a small museum focused on hidden family histories and women's experiences in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The museum opened in late 2024. The room where the trunk was found has been restored to its approximate 1900 appearance. Visitors can see where the trunk was hidden beneath the floorboards, marked now with clear plexiglass so you can look down into the space. The museum includes exhibits on asylum practices, anti-miscegenation laws, and the ways families across America hid relationships and children that didn't fit social norms. Magdalena's story is central, but the museum places it in broader context, showing she was one of thousands of women who faced similar circumstances. The museum also offers genealogy workshops, helping people research their own family histories and uncover hidden branches. Since opening, the museum has helped discover several other cases of erased family members in Richmond alone. A black woman who was the unacknowledged daughter of a prominent judge. A white man who married a Chinese immigrant and whose children were omitted from family records. An indigenous woman whose relationship with a white landowner produced children who were raised with false origins. Each case follows a similar pattern, a relationship or birth that violated social norms, a family decision to hide the truth, and generations of descendants who grew up not knowing their full heritage. The museum documents these stories, giving them the acknowledgement they were denied in their own time. For visitors to the museum, Magdalena's photograph is often the most affecting artifact. Something about her direct gaze, the way she looks straight into the camera, communicates a strength that transcends time. People stand in front of that photograph for long minutes, reading the story, then looking back at her face. Many visitors report feeling emotional, connecting Magdalena's experience to their own family secrets or their own struggles with family acceptance. The museum keeps a guest book where visitors can share reflections. The entries range from simple statements like, "Her courage inspires me," to longer narratives about people's own discoveries of hidden heritage or family estrangement. One entry reads, "My grandmother was sent away when she got pregnant at 16. We never talked about it. She died without ever telling me what happened to the baby." Seeing Magdalena's story makes me wish I had asked more questions while I had the chance. The educational impact of Magdalena's story extends into schools as well. History teachers in Virginia and beyond have begun including her case in units on women's history and civil rights. Students find her story compelling because she was young, only 21 when imprisoned, close to their own ages. They relate to her struggle for autonomy and her willingness to risk everything for love. Class discussions explore the historical context, helping students understand just how restricted women's choices were in 1900 and how recently anti-miscegenation laws existed in America. The last such laws weren't struck down until 1967. Magdalena's relationship with Joshua would have still been illegal in Virginia until just 57 years ago. This proximity, the fact that people alive today were born when such relationships were still criminalized, makes history feel immediate rather than distant. Some teachers use Magdalena's journal entries as primary source documents. Students analyze her writing, discussing what it reveals about her character, her education, her emotional state, and her understanding of her situation. They compare her perspective to how her family likely viewed the same events. They discuss why families like the Whitmores felt compelled to erase daughters like Magdalena rather than face social disapproval. And they consider what it takes for an individual to resist the overwhelming pressure of family, law, and social expectations. These discussions often lead students to reflect on their own lives, the pressures they face, and the courage required to be authentic in the face of disapproval. The story has also resonated internationally. News coverage of the discovery and the subsequent research reached audiences in Europe, Asia, and Latin America. People from countries with their own histories of rigid social hierarchies, forbidden relationships, and family secrets have found parallels to Magdalena's experience. A woman in India wrote to Sarah Caldwell describing how her own grandmother was disowned for marrying outside her caste. A man in Brazil shared that his great-grandfather was the mixed-race child of a wealthy landowner and an indigenous woman, never acknowledged by the father's family. These stories, while culturally specific, share common elements: the power of family and social structures to punish those who transgress boundaries, and the resilience of individuals who choose love or authenticity despite that punishment. As of now, 2024, Magdalena Rose Whitmore's story has been restored to history. Her name appears in updated Whitmore family genealogies. Her photograph is displayed in museums. Her journal entries are quoted in academic papers and taught in classrooms. Her descendants, through Sarah Caldwell and others, carry her memory forward with pride rather than shame. The lie that she died unmarried and childless in 1902 has been corrected. The truth, that she loved Joshua Morrison, bore 2 daughters, escaped an asylum, and lived freely for 18 years until the flu pandemic took her life, is now established fact. She is no longer erased. She is no longer forgotten. She is no longer the last of her line. She is the beginning of a line that continues 10 generations strong. If this story has moved you, if Magdalena's courage across more than a century has inspired you to think about hidden histories in your own family or your own community, I encourage you to take action. Share this documentary with others who might benefit from knowing her story. Support local historical societies and museums that work to uncover and preserve these hidden narratives. If you're interested in genealogy, consider researching your own family tree. You may discover gaps in the record, silences that hint at stories someone wanted hidden. And if you find those stories, share them. Give voice to the people who were erased. Honor their courage. Make sure their truth survives. Subscribe to this channel for more untold stories from history. Like this documentary if Magdalena's story resonated with you. And leave a comment sharing your thoughts or your own family's hidden histories. Together, we can ensure that no more stories like Magdalena's remain buried for another 100 years. Thank you for watching.